A ghost story for Christmas. We are history. Before I begin my reading, I shall recall the events that drove me to stand before you today. It was the tail end of the year 2020, and life was beginning to return to normal. Well, as normal as things would get for a few years after a global pandemic. My colleagues and I had returned to work in the old John Hawkins Library. This was before the concrete cube of a building was pulled down and replaced with the glass and steel Jack Leslie Tower we have today. It was just us staff who had been allowed back in during those early days. There was much work to do behind the scenes before we could open to the public. Along with establishing a one-way system, setting up social distancing signage and creating a COVID-secure workspace, there were also the usual end-of-year tasks that had been postponed due to our months in lockdown working from home. I had been assigned the task of removing the books from the history section that had not been out on loan for a number of years. Due to the way the Dewey Decimal System had been laid out for the building, the 900s, the history and geography texts, were on the basement floor, level 0. Thunder rumbled outside, I recalled. It had been threatening to rain since lunchtime. A dark cloak fell across the windows as I followed the one-way system and descended the appropriate staircase. The thunder rumbled again as the heavens opened. As I reached the bottom step, a shiver ran up my spine. It could be the height of summer, and level 0 would still feel like walking into a subterranean cavern. The motion sensor lights began to flicker on half-heartedly, as if providing illumination was going to be too much an effort for them today. Contemporary white metal shelving racks sat uncomfortably amongst the century-old wooden bookcase, as suave neon furniture gave a pop of colour to contrast with the grey stone walls and matching threadbare carpet. The floor was silent. There was always ambient noise in the library, but the absence of it created an eerie stillness which no sound dared disturb. Using an empty black book trolley as a makeshift desk, I set about my work. It was at this point I discovered that my simple task of removing books from the dozen shelves that covered the 940s to the 942s was going to take longer than I had expected. The spreadsheet I was to work from had been filtered alphabetically by title and not numerically by Dewey Decimal number. I resigned myself to be doing it all afternoon and made a start. My handling of the older books removed the thin layer of dust that obscured their true colours. I had completed the books starting with A and B and was about to move on to the ones beginning with C when I became aware of muffled footsteps. They were crisscrossing the floor, moving closer and closer. I walked down to the end of the shelving unit and looked around and saw no one. The footsteps stopped. I walked on to the 740s, the graphic novels decorative art section. The footsteps had started again, so I circled back up to the 900s, where I felt a presence behind me invading my personal space. Goosebumps scurried across my skin like rats leaving a sinking ship. I turned sharply to be met by a sea of white teeth. "Boo!" said the half-covered face of the hazelnut-haired woman who was wearing faded jeans and a vintage Simon and Garfunkel t-shirt. It was Henrietta Marie, our senior librarian and chief mischief maker. She was senior more by experience than position. Hetty, as she was known to her friends, had been working in the library since she had left school, and knew all the nooks and crannies unscrupulous readers hid books in. 2 meters social distancing, I objected, as she laughed from behind her shark jaw face mask. What are you doing down here anyway? I said, attempting to camouflage my lack of composure. Searching for missing books and scaring people, obviously, said Hetty cheekily as she skipped off. See ya. I'm off to scare more people upstairs. I returned like some historical gardener to my reading of the history section, every reverberating noise reminding me that I was once again alone with the sound of silence. As I progressed, I noticed a pattern emerging from the content I was taking out of circulation. They were all books that revelled in the glorification of the British Empire. Plumes of dust fell like snowflakes as I reached down a book from the top shelf. A pungent smell of mould-ridden old garments filled the air. I coughed. The oversized blood-red leather-bound tome had embossed gold lettering on the cover and that read, "The Manifest of Civilization." In the back of my mind, I was sure I'd already removed that book from the shelf. Then again, all these old books did look the same. It was, however, damp to the touch. I coughed again as I stepped down off the kickstep. There was a splash as I stepped into a pool of water. Rain must have started seeping in through the fire escape, I thought. I placed the book on the trolley and went to investigate. The area around the fire door was bone dry, despite the best efforts of the raging storm outside. The angry wind roared as it swept the rain against the glass. As I walked back to my work, there was a series of clink, clunk, as the motion sensor lights at the far end of the floor started to turn themselves off. A wave of darkness swept up the floor, leaving just a spotlight on history. In hindsight, I can hear the supernatural alarm bells chiming as I recount this moment. However, at the time I was too wrapped up with my work to hear them ringing. I replaced the large red leather hardback on the trolley for what you will recall is the second or possibly the third time, and continued through the spreadsheet. Once completed, I wheeled the trolley of unwanted text to the storeroom, where they would await disposal. As I made my way across the lower level of the library, the lights failed to come on. My foot clipped something. Whatever it was made a metallic sound as it shunted across the floor. I stopped to see what it was. I picked up a horseshoe-shaped object with disc-like stamps at each end. It was made of bronze or copper. I have it here somewhere. I'll pass it around and you can examine it as I continue with the rest of my story. As I walked on, out of the darkness came voices. You might put it down to a runaway imagination, but I was there, and I know what I heard. They started quietly, hushed and slow at first, but grew louder and louder the further I got from the light. They were chanting. It was a language I could not identify. To my best of my memory, it went Minu Tarahe. Minu Tarahe. Aggressive undertones were evident. I quickened my pace. The intense pounding from my heart was now marching in tempo with the rhythmic voices. Minu Tarahe. Minu Tarahe. Minu Tarahe. I broke into a run. Then the floor slid away from my feet. The room had lurched to one side. I'd lost my footing, tumbled. The trolley crashed to the floor as the bucks flew in all directions. The floor dropped level again with a thud. The last of the lights went out. As I scrambled to my feet, aftershocks of pain rippled through my limbs. Something felt different. I fumbled for my torch or my phone to bring some light to the situation. The screen was cracked, from preventing me from increasing the brightness. It had fallen hard against another one of those items handle. A pungent smell of human effluence assaulted my nostrils. My stomach threatened to reproduce my lunch. I looked around. The coarse grey carpet had been removed, exposing wooden floorboards beneath. The room lurched again, before settling into a more stable rocking motion. I gathered up what books I could and made a dash for the storeroom, but I could not find it in the dark. The chanting was now accompanied by the sound of a rolling ocean. I was taking rapid, short breaths. My face mask was suffocating me. I ripped it off. The air felt hot and clammy. There was so little of it to gasp. My back contracted, as if being squeezed in a vice of fear. Flight overruled fight. I had to find a way off the floor. I paced on the spot, pressing the call button again and again. But I could not wait for the lift to descend from the fourth floor. I headed for the stairs. The door was locked. I flashed my torch upon it. Of course. No entry. I should have known. This stairwell was swipe access down only. If I wanted off the floor, I had to use the other stairs on the far side, by the rare book collection. My eyes strained to find some light as my arms reached for familiar surfaces to guide my way. I should have known how to navigate through the middle passage of the shelves and bookcases. However, they appeared to have vanished, along with all the tables and chairs. The floor was an empty, obsidian black expanse. The silence was punctuated by the groaning and creaking of the wooden floorboards as they flexed with every step I took. The sounds echoed from disorientating directions. Once or twice my head scraped a ceiling crossbeam that wasn't there before. The temperature had risen. Sweat was dripping from my forehead. My throat ran dry, as I had a creeping feeling I was no longer in the library. There was a squeak as something small scurried between my legs. I shone my limited light down. Rats. I jolted to avoid a swarm of rodents. I tumbled forward, falling against someone. A pair of ivory eyes stared out of the ebony darkness. I dropped my phone. Hetty? I asked, knowing it wasn't. I reached out to feel who stood before me. My hands touched her shoulder. Could I could feel defined bones. There was little flesh on the body. Judging by the height, the person's head was level with mine. My trembling fingers moved closer to feel the face. It was waxy to the touch. Scars were evident. My fingers crept with trepidation to explore further. There was a horrific crack from above. as if an ancient tree had snapped in a storm. Yet there were no trees that old near the library. An enormous timber, knotted with rope and cloth, smashed through the roof. Splinters rained down. Water splashed hard on my face. Salt water. Light flooded in. As my eyes adjusted, I heard voices issuing commands. As relentless lightning cracked, I looked around. I appeared to be in the bowels of a ship. The vessel was packed full of shaven-haired, bare-torso, gaunt, malnourished men of African origin. Each was bound at the waist and chained to the deck. From what I could see, these men appeared to be squeezed together with less than 1 meter distance between them. In retrospect, I'm shocked to recall that my first thought I had was how quickly an infectious disease would spread amongst them. The one before me was holding the enormous red volume I had removed from the library. Minu Tarahe. We are history, the man intoned in a deep voice. You will return our book, he continued as he thrust the tome towards me. Sea water swirled through the hole. It sloshed around in a constant rolling space. Are we not worth more than that 1 manila you'll carry? The crescent object in my pocket, its presence felt. What I can't. My brain struggled to find the rational words as it attempted to process the irrational circumstance it found itself in. There are other books that must tell your story better, I stammered, as my brain finally put aside its skepticism of the situation. Not our story. No others list our true names. This book, for better or for worse, is the only record of our existence. I have to remove it, I protested. There was a throbbing noise coming from behind me. Someone was hammering on the bulkhead. The water had risen up to my knees. My feet had gone numb. My gut clenched as the cold water rose further. I began to strategize escape routes from drowning. None were forthcoming, as if they were aware that I was thinking more about my own survival than theirs. Every pair of eyes turned upon me. I felt them bore to my soul, ready to pass judgment on what I did or said next. When I did and said nothing, the chained collective spoke in unison. Were others of our kind treated better by the Dutch, by the Portuguese, or by the Spanish? They asked. There was a hush of expectation as I formulated a reply. The ship listed heavily to one side. Waters had reached my chest. I could hear panic cries of women and children as I spoke with all the sincerity I could muster. No, they were not. Yet you remove our book. The voices had taken on a threatening undertone. You deny our history. And men in chains shouted, history should not be removed. History should not be censored or denied. And we are history. The echo was deafening. But, I stammered. "No one reads it anymore." The man before me leaned forward. There was a clink as his bonds reached the limit, and he whispered into my ear, "Then maybe you should read it to them." I chose not to debate his request further, and neither should you. As I took the book from the enslaved human's hands, I promised him that I would ensure his story and those of his shackled acquaintances would not be forgotten. So here I stand, on the anniversary of the sinking of the slave ship Civilization, to read out the names of the 458 souls listed as human cargo in its manifest.